This episode of New Politics was released on the 30th of November, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, have the Australian Greens been taught a few political lessons on housing, the end of Parliament for the year, and chasing war criminals in Israel? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, billionaire philanthropist who fights crime of an evening.
And just our regular message, listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack, or you can donate at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
It was the final week of Parliament and it's all finished up for the year. The government's two housing bills, the Build to Rent and Help to Buy schemes, they've been passed through the Senate with the support of the Australian Greens, and this legislation has been stalled for such a long time. The Greens were after an additional 25,000 social and affordable houses, as well as a few other changes, and the government just refused to entertain any of these ideas. And for a long time, these issues have played out politically. The Greens have been positioning themselves as the party of renters, and why not? Around 31% of all people in Australia do live in rental accommodation. The government has been accusing the Greens of siding with the Liberal and National parties to block progress on housing, and then calling them the Greens political party at every opportunity. And eventually, the minor parties need to know their place and let the government implement their policies, even if they're not the best policies. Here's what the Greens housing policy spokesperson, Max Chandler-Mather, had to say after the legislation was passed.
Well, there comes a point where you realise you've pushed as hard as you can, and we really tried to push Labor on acting on soaring rents, on phasing out the tax handouts for property investors or establishing a public developer to build genuinely affordable housing. And what we've decided is to pass these two housing bills and take that fight to the next election. Well, we'll be working hard to keep Dutton out and pushing Labor to act on capping rent increases, on phasing out negative gearing. We went into this process assuming that we'd be able to get a similar positive outcome that we got last year on the Housing Australia Future Fund, where we secured $3 billion of extra investment in social housing, 6 times what Labor originally wanted to spend. That was really positive. And we had assumed that a similar process would happen this time. And look, we are disappointed that at the end, Labor didn't want to shift at all and felt like they were really abandoning a lot of renters who really need help right now.
And what the Australian Greens were proposing on housing, pretty much across the board, I think is sound policy. And the two big components of that, negative gearing and the rate of capital gains tax, they're the main causes of the unaffordability of housing right across Australia. And many analysts agree that when the Howard government halved capital gains tax in the year 2000, that's when the problem started, and in conjunction with a wide range of other economic issues has culminated in the problems that we have today in housing. And eventually sound policy will get defeated by politics. The Labor Party did propose amendments to negative gearing and capital gains tax in 2019, and it believes that it lost the 2019 election because of these policies, even though the evidence proves otherwise. And here we have the solutions that are staring the government right in the face, yet they refuse to budge on this. And governments do have a right to govern, but other political parties do have a right to make these policies better. And I think this is what the Australian Greens were trying to do. They tried it out, they were unsuccessful, but this is how the political system operates.
It looks like the Greens have learnt a lesson on how politics works. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, I don't think the Greens should change their policy to fall into line with the government of the day. I don't think that's a very sensible or even desirable thing. The Greens has their ideologies, their beliefs, and you can make compromises around that while maintaining your ideology and beliefs and even your policy. And they seem to have managed to find that way to compromise.
Oh, but I think overall this is the stuff of real politics,
Yeah.
where political outcomes will always trump good policy. But the Greens probably also realised that they were going to get all the blame for this legislation not being passed, and that might have been one of Albanese's strategies. And with the housing crisis not going away anytime soon, it's still likely to be an issue at the next federal election, and they've probably come to the realisation that the Prime Minister hates the Australian Greens more than he hates the Liberal Party.
I think that's... You tend to hate the people closer to you in politics anyway, it seems. Paul Keating famously said after the Labor conference, the Liberal Party had no chance by the time the right had smacked the left around and the left had tried to smack the right around. And the bitter hatreds of Labor members towards other Labor members historically far outweighed their hatred towards Liberal Party. And often the other sides would go off and have a nice social drink with each other. And we've seen that a little bit, I think, with Penny Wong and Simon Birmingham's professional friendship. And that's fine, but it probably makes it harder, this type of thing, to go the mongrel, as it were. And again, I'm not criticising people for being friends and disagreeing fundamentally but still being able to get on. There is a sense in which we need more of that. But I wonder if part of the reason that Labor is kowtowing to the Liberal Party is that they don't trust each other enough, but they can trust the other side just enough to keep everybody else honest.
Oh, but I've always felt that the Senate should be a house of review, improve the legislation if there's flaws in it, and then possibly move the policy or the legislation towards their line of thinking, or try to get more benefits in their respective states as senators. And this is what Brian Harradine from Tasmania always used to do with the Howard government all those years ago. But ultimately, governments are elected to implement their policies, and if it ends up being bad policy and poorly implemented, well, they are the ones that have to suffer at the next election. But that's what the dynamic is in politics. You know, what do senators do if the legislation is just so obviously flawed and bad policy? You can't expect senators to just say, oh, well, that's an awful bit of legislation, but that's the government of the day, we'll just go and approve it and hope for the best. They have to consider the public interest as well. And maybe if the government had consulted with the crossbench on the National Anti-Corruption Commission instead of solely relying on Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party for their support and their approval, I think the government could have avoided all the problems that they're having with the National Anti-Corruption Commission today. You know, the crossbench might have said, oh, that Brereton fellow, he's not going to be very good, you better find someone else. Or, wow, you're talking about holding these hearings in private. That's not going to be good enough. The public needs to have a better understanding of how these decisions are made. This is what we need to see in a good National Anti-Corruption Commission. That's what the Senate could have done on that occasion, or the crossbench might have done on that occasion. So there has to be a time and a place for more Senate deliberation on these issues and negotiations with the crossbench. And I'd say that it has to be all the time. It would have resulted in a much better anti-corruption commission. It probably would have resulted in better housing policy as well.
I think so. The Senate committee system was always extremely good at fixing a lot of bad legislation. Didn't fix all of it, of course. I don't want to say that every single piece of legislation passed by the Australian Parliament has been a bastion of good policy, good law and good legislative practice. But certainly the excesses were trimmed, shall we say. I think despite the party's better efforts, and in a sense understandable efforts, I don't agree with them, but I do understand where they're coming from. I don't think we're going to get less independents next election. I think there's going to be more of them, and possibly more Green members. And I think they've got to start to work out who are the smart independents and how do we make sure that our legislative program is attractive to them so that they will support us, not just in cases of supply and support, which is generally the default position, and that's all good, but also in terms of having a progressive legislative program. But in progressive, I mean both senses of the word, in that one, it's, well, progressive and not regressive like the Liberal Party seems to want, but also progressive is that things get done and they pass legislation that, and they're not bogged down in endless debates and filibusters and Dorothy Dix questions that just fill in time and things like that, that they're actually getting things done. The Gillard government was really the model in this. I think it set the record and holds the record for the most amount of legislation passed in a single term. The Abbott government, first thing it did was basically state we're not interested in passing lots of legislation. And okay, whatever. That's for another day. That was a minority government with a Senate that could be hostile too. It wasn't a terribly hostile Senate, but it required a lot of tight negotiations to keep the numbers where they were. So it can be done. You just have to be prepared to retain the belief in your own policies and program and do the hard work of dealing with everyone who can affect the vote and blocking off all the ways that the vote can be knocked down.
And just on housing, Max Chandler Mather is being pushed forward by the Labor Party as Australia's most hated man, even though, as far as I'm concerned, all he's trying to do is to get the Labor government to implement their own policies. And I think that for the Australian Greens and the younger people in the electorate, he's a bit of a champion. And we found out that during the week he donates $50,000 from his own salary towards a community free meal program in his own electorate. And I don't want this to sound like the Max Chandler Mather show, but here is Max Chandler Mather again responding to a question at the National Press Club this week.
Small family, we're on a single income, and I give up about $50,000 of my salary to run all the free meal programs we run in the electorate. So can talk about it if you like. We, using that money, we've served now over about 50,000 free meals, including in our 3 weekly free school breakfasts in state schools. My view is when I got elected, I was elected by a movement of people who, a lot of whom are low-income renters, and it wasn't right for me not to give up a big portion of my salary to make sure that I could give back to that movement and the electorate that I represent. Because of that, giving up that money and being on a single income and in an inner city electorate with very, very high median house price, it is actually sort of difficult at the moment to buy a house there. I want to be clear though, I'm not the one doing it tough, but I'm answering your question.
And there's not many politicians doing this kind of thing, donating a large portion of their salary towards this type of cause. Malcolm Turnbull used to donate his entire salary as Prime Minister to charity. I think there should be more of this. So someone donating $50,000 of their salary to charity, well, they can't be all that bad, but the media narrative throughout this week was that Chandler Mather and the Australian Greens, well, they've been taught a big political lesson this week, and that you have to realise as a minority party that there are limits to how far you can push the government, and there doesn't seem to be any real limit if it's News Corporation or the mining industry. That's a different issue, of course. But I guess we'll find out at the next federal election who's actually been taught the political lesson from this saga on housing.
The first point I want to make is that I see you, Max Chandler Mather, and bring in the figure of Peter Dutton as the most hated person in Australia. I speak to a lot of people on all sides of politics, and Max Chandler Mather isn't terribly popular, particularly amongst, I think you're right, over older voters. I think he gains a bit under younger voters, but Dutton doesn't get that gain. He's not trusted, he's not liked, he's not respected. It's always couched in terms of, oh, he's not that bad, or unlike, and again, I think I've said this before, but it's worth saying again, John Howard, who was loved by segments of the voting community. And while the left denies that, it makes it hard to remove his legacy. Not everyone, of course. He was also deeply loathed by, I'd say, nearly everyone listening here. But Dutton doesn't have that small section of people who love him. I don't think Max Chandler Mather is prominent enough just yet to have the strong feelings that Peter Dutton and more recently Anthony Albanese have engendered amongst their followers and their ex-followers. I suspect too that it's more that he's loud and insistent and not terribly appropriate in the way he develops arguments, and a bit of maturity and growth may temper that a little bit, but he's got to win the next election and stay in for a few more years for us to know this for sure.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
final week of Parliament was also notable for the legislation that wasn't passed. The Misinformation and Disinformation Bill was withdrawn by the government, and they couldn't get the support from either the opposition or the crossbench for this bill. Here's the Minister for Communication, Michelle Rowland, speaking about this bill just a few weeks ago.
The strong and clear advice we have received from our regulators is that mis and disinformation is a problem now. The community is rightly concerned and wants action. The Australian Media Literacy Alliance highlights that 80% of Australians want the spread of misinformation in Australia to be addressed.
And the Minister wanted to support the community so much that she's withdrawn the legislation. And generally, when a government wants to make it look like they are doing something about a particular issue without actually doing anything about it, they create draft legislation that they know is not going to be supported by anyone in Parliament. And then when it gets knocked back, they say that they tried really, 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 really hard and then blame the Greens political party or the Shields political party or blame someone else. And it looks like this will be kicked down the road somewhere or just kicked out of Parliament altogether. And it's almost in the same place as the truth in political advertising legislation that the government promised to introduce before the next federal election. That seems to have gone nowhere, and that was a half-hearted proposal as well. So all of these good things the government could be introducing, they just don't seem to be very interested in.
It's a strange way to end the parliamentary term, knowing that there's got to be an election around May. You'd think that they'd want to go out with a couple of banger bits of legislation that really set the narrative, to use that awful, unimaginative term coined and beloved by Australian journalists, but to really underscore that first Labor term meant. Instead, we have some achievement, and there's no doubt there's been some achievement, and some of it has been good. Some of it is minor but interesting. Some of it, like the management of the economy, has been good, even though most people aren't noticing that because of the cost of living crisis. And so I guess all the good things about inflation coming down and job rate rising a bit and things like that get cancelled out by the fact that people are still struggling to pay for things. The Reserve Bank has a lot to do with that by not putting down interest rates when they should have and by not putting them up when they should have. But nonetheless, the government is taking the blame for that. And I suppose that's the right thing as well. I would have looked at what can we do to make us look as good as possible with some legislation that will make an impact at the election, rather than dropping this, dropping that, arguing over the behaviour of women of colour, which happened yesterday. Lydia Thorpe was suspended from the Senate for throwing a bit of paper at Pauline Hanson, who has been for years telling Lydia Thorpe she shouldn't be there and that she has no right and that all other kinds of things. And Fatima Payman also telling Pauline Hanson that she's a racist. And Labor are happy for this type of thing to go on, and those are important things to happen, not the suspension so much, but the criticism of One Nation is really important. But Labor is not supporting it, and they're not doing anything to say, while that's going on, we've got this. So, yeah, Thorpe threw a bit of paper at Pauline Hanson.
Well, we can't have bits of paper thrown around in the Senate. That's totally unacceptable.
Sure. No, that's right. Someone might get a paper cut and then, the lemon juice comes out and it's all awful. Yeah, in Taiwan, there's often fistfights break out. So we have a fairly mellow parliamentary system, even in the bear pit of New South Wales. There's been a little bit of shoving, I think, but it's generally more abuse and bullying, which is much better, not, than violent outbursts of physicality. But having been censured earlier in the week, I think it was a bit of overkill to suspend Lydia Thorpe from the Senate.
And also most of this legislation that has been passed or has been withdrawn, aside from all the paper that's been thrown around in the Senate, I think it is a sign of a government caving into vested interests and not supporting the interests of the public. The donations reform legislation from last week, that's in the interest of the major political parties. There were no problems with that, and had the leader of the opposition supporting that even before the ink was dry on the bit of paper that it was created on. And draconian immigration and asylum seeker legislation, ultimately that's in the interests of the major political parties, and both of them are pandering to xenophobia and racist elements in the community, because neither of them have got the courage to stand up to any of this. And we also had the plan to reduce tax concessions on superannuation balances of over $3 million cancelled, and that's something that affects 1% of all superannuation balances, and it's usually a tax dodge implemented by high income earners who can afford good accountants, and that's been cancelled. And it wasn't a tax on the whole lot, it was to be tax on amounts over $3 million in those superannuation accounts. And the Prime Minister has decided to cancel this because he didn't want a repeat of the share franking credits issue from the 2019 election, which Labor thinks cost at the election. Well, I can tell you what, this will be an issue at the next election because it's something that you'd expect a Labor government to do without even blinking. And I actually thought that this legislation had gone through. It's on the Australian Taxation Office website as something that's going to come through on the 1st of July 2025, and here we have the Labor government dumping this policy. So it seems that the important stuff that would make a difference to the community and make the political system better and make the taxation system better just gets stuffed around and ultimately disappears. And legislation that we desperately need gets dumped. The legislation that we don't need gets approved. And I just think that government processes just have to be a lot better than this.
Yeah, the electorate wants better, and I think being better than the last government isn't good enough. It needs to be better and reach the standards that Australians expect. Now, you're not going to please everybody. You just never are. But I think you're going to make sure that it's harder for those that don't like you to argue against what you're doing when you're doing things properly and well. Even if they disagree, they can say, well, they did it well, I don't like it, but I can see why it might be worthwhile to some people. Sometimes that's the best you can get from people.
I'm just on that point of independence that we talked about before and the possibility of a minority government after the next election. I think that we can see that increasingly Labor and the Liberal National parties are becoming increasingly desperate for their own survival. And I'm not suggesting that they won't exist after the next election, but they're just desperate about their long-term future. And we saw that with trying to generate more public funds through the Electoral Commission for them to survive, raising the public funding for each vote from $3 up to $5, and preparing legislation that supports their interests and their vested interests rather than the public interest. And I think a good example of that is the gambling ads legislation that the government has stalled on, and that was promised 18 months ago, well, it's been in consideration for 18 months, and that's all about protecting the powerful gambling industry and protecting the political donations that arise from that, not just to the Labor Party, but to the Liberal and National parties as well. And this is all about dirty politics and protecting whoever pays up. And I think that it's naive to suggest that all legislation in Parliament, in the Senate, is going to be judged on its merits. Politics and opportunism always comes first when it comes to a two-party political system like we have in Australia. But generally, I think that with all of this stalled legislation and the stuff that's been dumped, it's just a question of whether it would have been better for the government to negotiate more meaningfully with the crossbench on these bigger picture issues. And this is a theme that we've picked up on over the past few weeks or so, but Anthony Albanese has been hostile to the New Teal independents virtually from day one when he decided that he was going to cut their staffing and resources support. And historically, he's always had that hostility towards the Australian Greens, and some of that is justified, but most of it is not, in my opinion. And I think that generally politics is always about the alliances that you form. And as I suggested before, there is a very strong chance that the next parliament is going to be led by a minority government. And I don't think that I'm being overly dramatic to suggest that this current government could be the last majority government that we have for a long time. And generally that would not be a bad thing. But all of this hostility towards the Australian Greens and towards the crossbench and keeping them locked out from negotiations on key legislation, I just think that that's possibly something that Anthony Albanese might come to regret. Based on what happened at the last election, where Labor just scraped across the line, and sure, the Liberal Party wasn't anywhere near being able to form government, but just based on the fact that the Albanese government scraped across the line, and usually the high watermark for a change government is usually their first election victory, it would have been far better to have all of these people on side rather than being antagonistic towards them.
I've been thinking about this in a broader historical context, but the Labor Party formed in the 1890s based on the arguments, which was a form of really Marxism mixed in with some other British socialist ideas, etc. It splits in 1917 over really should Australia support the empire as deeply as it should have. It splits again in 1931 over economic. It splits again in 1950 over how socialist should it be. And I've reduced and expanded these arguments, so we're not here for 4 hours. It does, however, do what the Liberal Party usually does and uses its factions to shape the party in the way that those factions feels is best. But we haven't really moved beyond that Hawke and Keating 1980s model. Now, Kevin Rudd and Jim Chalmers at separate times, and Wayne Swan too. So Kevin Rudd, Jim Chalmers and Wayne Swan have been trying to change it, but there's been resistance from the older guard of the Labor Party. But really, a lot of the arguments that they're having are arguments from at least 20 years ago, which is why I think they're struggling to gain a foothold, because the population has, whether knowingly or not, but they've moved on. It's the same with the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party, I think they too are fighting the battles of the 1980s. And I don't think that there's any current serving or prominent current serving Liberal member who's looking at new ways of approaching the economy, unlike Jim Chalmers, unlike Kevin Rudd, unlike Wayne Swan. The Liberal Party is stuck in a Thatcherist, Howard-esque holding pattern where they become less and less relevant. Labor is trying, but I don't think it's enough, but I suppose at least they're trying. The Greens' economic credentials just get hammered even when they're sound, because we've got a media prefers the old ways because that's what they're used to, and they're not prepared to learn the new ways of things, because that Thatcherist neoliberalism is very simple. It's hidden behind a lot of jargon, but it's very simple. Basically, money floats up and the rich are going to get all the money. And when the rich have all the money, that means the economy is doing well. That's what it breaks down to. And then hopefully the rich will then hire more people, or they might keep their profit. So this has been a long and meandering discourse over that. I think the parties have died because they haven't moved with the times enough. And I think that we're just going to see more and more independence, at least in the short to medium term. And some of those independents may unite and form new parties that are serious about 21st century concerns rather than reheated 19th and 20th century concerns.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and this has created a debate in Australia about whether the federal government should support this or not. And this has fallen along party lines, with the Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong, suggesting that Australia will support the decision of the court, and to me this is the more obvious thing to do.
In relation to the International Criminal Court, Australia respects the independence of the International Criminal Court and its important role in upholding international law. That adherence to international law is a matter of principle, and it is in Australia's interests. I have made clear many times in this place that all parties to the conflict must comply with international law, and I again say we respect the independence of the International Criminal Court and its important role in upholding international law.
The Liberal Party opposition has attacked this and cannot believe that the International Criminal Court has issued this arrest warrant. Here's Senator Michaelia Cash.
In relation to the reaction, completely, totally and utterly shameful. And yet again, Australia is at odds with our greatest ally and security partner in the United States of America. President Biden's statement, short and simple. It is utterly outrageous, the issuing of the warrants, and there is no moral equivalent between Israeli leaders and Hamas terrorists. And certainly, given the actions of the ICC, we certainly do have grounds now to reconsider our membership of the organisation. But very quickly, Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong, pick up the phone to Prime Minister Netanyahu and tell him that he is welcome in Australia any time.
And she might actually have a point here, because Australia does have a history of welcoming war criminals to Australia since the end of the Second World War, from Nazi Germany, Yugoslavia, Cambodia, Argentina, Chile. And this was all documented in the book by Mark Aarons, War Criminals Welcome. I highly recommend that. So Benjamin Netanyahu might feel right at home over here if he comes over here. But aside from that, the coalition has called for Australia to withdraw from the International Criminal Court. And we have to remember that Australia is an important part of this court, which has seen many war criminals prosecuted since it was set up in 2002. And within that structure, that includes war criminals from the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sudan, Uganda, and also arrest warrants for other people like Vladimir Putin in Russia. So I don't think we can pick and choose which war criminals will go to jail or which ones have to go to court and which ones will go free. And the International Criminal Court was set up for a reason. And if Benjamin Netanyahu sets foot on Australian soil, well, he should be arrested and sent off to The Hague and face the consequences of his actions.
Australia joined the International Criminal Court under the leadership of the government that was in from 1996 to 2007. I can't quite think of his name. John Howard's government set it up. And it was Alexander Downer who was serving as foreign minister. So when he comes out blaring about things, yes, Alexander, we have long memories here. Why was it good then? And I suppose if it's poorer African nations, then it's a good thing, which is really the same attitude many of the senior Liberals have towards domestic law and order. If it's poor people of colour, then the full brunt of the law should be foisted upon them. If it's not, then the law should be just and fair and merciful and all of that. Israel is in, I think, an impossible position. It is pretty much a pariah state. I'm not sure. Netanyahu can probably visit the United States. I think he can go to Russia, which isn't a part of the ICC, and America's not a part of the ICC. There's a few African countries he can go to, but not in his general vicinity. Basically, his position's untenable, and he's only holding on because he knows the second he loses the presidency, he goes to jail. It doesn't remove the problem of the Israeli government, but it shows its weakness and makes it harder for such anti-Palestinian governments to get through. I think we're heading towards another 1989 through 92 with the collapse of things like apartheid, like the communist countries. I think Israel's put itself into a position where the only way it can keep going is to continue genocides and attempted genocides and invasions of valid states and states it can't win against. It's very hard to beat Lebanon. It's very hard to beat Syria. It's very hard to beat Iran and Iraq. Iran and Iraq are so tough to beat they couldn't beat each other. The war they had ended in stalemate. Lebanon has had war for 60 years on and off, longer maybe. Israel with its depleted army, with its stretched too thin army and, well, defense force. And if America decides, and it would have to be in the next 6 weeks or so, that it can't support Israel anymore, it's game over for it, I think, not only as a parliamentary system, but as a country. And we run into a crisis of another kind.
Well, I guess the other point is that Benjamin Netanyahu, just bringing you back to domestic issues, Benjamin Netanyahu is unlikely to visit Australia soon. He was here back in 2017, but it's very unlikely now. So all of these discussions that are happening domestically could be all moot. But his reaction to the arrest warrant was that old trope that it's all an anti-Jewish conspiracy and it's all anti-Semitic.
The anti-Semitic decision of the International Court in The Hague is a modern Dreyfus trial, and it will end the same way. It is falsely accusing me, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel, of deliberately targeting civilians. This when we do everything in our power to avoid civilian casualties. The truth is simple. No war is more just than the war that Israel has been waging in Gaza, the decision to issue an arrest warrant against me was made by a rogue prosecutor who's trying to extricate himself from sexual harassment charges, and by biased judges who are motivated by anti-Semitic sentiments against the one and only Jewish state.
Well, no, it's not being anti-Semitic, it's the law. If anyone tries to act out a genocide, deliberately starves people, blocks aid coming into Palestine, blockades the entire country of Palestine, continues to be an occupying force, practices apartheid and kills over 45,000 people, 2/3 of those are women and young children, practices cultural genocide and eco-genocide, and then they're forced to appear in an international court, well, that's not being anti-Semitic. That's the act of a court of law wanting to try someone who is a genocidal maniac. And if Benjamin Netanyahu is so sure of his innocence, well, maybe he should turn up to the International Criminal Court and argue his case. And in the court of law, you're always innocent until proven guilty, so turn up and argue your case. And of course he's not going to do that because he's got so much evidence against him, and all of the war crimes that he has either implemented or supported and condoned, that's all been recorded on social media by Israeli Defence Force soldiers, and it's all been televised all around the world. And the other point is that the International Criminal Court has worked so well in the past. No one complained when it indicted all of those political and military leaders when atrocities were being committed in many parts of Africa or in the former Yugoslavia. No one complained when the ICC issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and other military leaders in Russia. So we can't have people like Michaelia Cash, saying that the court should be scrapped or Australia shouldn't recognise the decision made by the court just because it doesn't suit her agenda or the agenda of Israel. She's the Shadow Attorney General and was actually the Attorney General several years ago. She should know the law better than that. The arrest warrants are there and the law should be obeyed, just as it has been in all of those other cases run by the International Criminal Court.
It's incredible that a person who sees themselves as Australia's premier legal figure doesn't seem to understand this. She's not really qualified. I think she's probably been the least qualified Attorney General since Billy Hughes in 1904.
Oh, but I guess the point with Michaelia Cash is that, sure, she is a qualified lawyer, but that doesn't mean that she should have become Attorney General at that time, and she's Shadow Attorney General now. But the things that she's saying are political talking points, not legal points.
It astounds me that she doesn't seem to have the grasp of the law that Attorney General, and the current Liberal Party hasn't had George Brandis being the best of them, and he was terrible. And he forced himself into getting a sea ship from Queensland. And when you look at Liberal Attorney Generals, who included Latham, who becomes noted Chief Justice of the High Court, Barwick, who becomes a noted Chief Justice of the High Court, you don't have to agree with these people, but they were substantial legal minds. It's just incredible. Joski, another extremely effective Attorney General. And we're down to Brandis. I can't remember Michaelia Cash. It's just incredible. And to not accept the ruling of the ICC and to seemingly not accept Australia being a signatory is just beyond comprehension to me. Again, it goes down to the destruction of the party.
I'm just putting this all into historical context, and as you mentioned before, David, Israel is a pariah state at the moment. It's certainly behaving like it, and it's implemented a cruel apartheid state. It's currently committing genocide in Palestine. That's why those arrest warrants are being made at the ICC, and it's exporting its terror into Lebanon and beyond. And this arrest warrant is the first step in a long process to make Israel start behaving like a normal society and like a normal country. And it hasn't been doing this ever since it was formed back in 1948. And I think because it's been so obvious to the world over the past 14 months just how badly it can behave, the international mood to force Israel to change has increased during this time. It's not complete, but it's starting to roll in that way. And you mentioned the end of apartheid in South Africa before. So that was 1990, and just like the end of communism in the Eastern Bloc in Europe in 1989, change does happen very slowly, but then the end happens very quickly. And change in Israel and Palestine could happen very quickly too. And all of those things started off roughly at the same time historically. Communism in the Eastern Bloc, apartheid in South Africa, the creation of Israel and the Nakba, all commenced after the end of the Second World War, albeit for different reasons. But there are consistent factors at the end of these processes. The end of apartheid and communism was accelerated and forced by economic and international moral issues, and Israel is going through these same issues at the moment. It's on the verge of economic collapse, and most reasonable people in the international sphere cannot accept what Israel is doing in Palestine and Lebanon. So there is now a ceasefire in place between Israel and Lebanon, and that's to be welcomed, of course, although it's hard to know how long that will hold for. Palestine is the next big issue that has to be resolved, but it's hard to see much of this changing while Netanyahu is still involved in politics. And you referred to this before as well, David. He probably realises that once he stops being the Prime Minister, he's probably off to The Hague as well, or in an Israel jail. So I'm not going to predict anything, but just pointing out that the positive resolution historically, whenever it comes, it takes everyone by surprise, and it does happen very quickly. But whatever the case is, the situation in Palestine cannot keep going on like this forever.
No, it can't. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible situation. Dealing with it by places like America and Australia and England has been appalling, and it's got to end. It's just got to end. I know people with family in Lebanon whose village was razed. 60 people in the village were killed. They've been bombing Beirut. Young Israeli soldiers are being killed to keep Bibi Netanyahu out of jail. And I think there's going to be a realisation that this is the point, that the nationalist rhetoric is going to be seen through in the short term. And yeah, it took, 5 years for the apartheid to sort of happen. But that last stage, as you said, was very quick. And I'm wondering if we're in the last stage now of the Zionist movement.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.